And now here joining us to discuss this major foreign policy speech coming out of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is Katarzyna Pisarska, the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum and the Pulaski Institute, from the Pulaski Institute. Hello, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, guys.
Absolutely. Now, we're expecting this major foreign policy speech that could take up to an hour and a half long, and, well, we're all contemplating what are going to be the major changes to Poland's foreign policy, things that we can absolutely highlight and point out that is a significant difference from what we saw in the last government.
First, I think we have to point out that these annual foreign policy speeches are extremely comprehensive documents because the Minister of Foreign Affairs generally has to cover all areas of the world. We speak not only about Europe, about European security, we talk about the transatlantic alliance, of course, but we talk about our relations with Africa and Asia. So, of course, there's so much material to cover on top of bilateral commitments and relations that we have with our neighbors. But I think this speech is going to be different for one single reason. And here I would cite our Prime Minister, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who said a few weeks ago that Europe is in a pre-war era. And that has profound consequences on how we think about foreign policy and how we prepare for the future. The previous speeches have been, although of course at times, the last two, at times of war in Ukraine, the invasion of Russia, since 2014, the annexation of Crimea by Russia. Of course, all these events indicated a general shift in the European security environment. But I think now, after 2 years of war, we do understand here in Poland that it has a potential of a spillover that's going to affect the Baltic states, Poland, Western Europe, and the transatlantic alliance as a whole. So I think the speech will be around this main theme, that Europe is potentially in a pre-war era. And the question, how do we prepare for this through foreign policy tools and instruments, I think is going to be key message of Minister Radosław Sikorski.
Well, if we can just nail down perhaps some specific points per se, because we know that he's going to be focusing less on regions. I've read in the press that he's going to be focusing on issues per se.
Yes, and I think that's a good approach for the very simple reason that in the past we had a very clear path for more cooperation, more prosperity, more security, so we could focus on how we develop these relations with specific regions. Now again, we have a major challenge in front of us: a war in Ukraine, a war with an effect of the spillover. So it is, I think, very smart to take specific issues, put them on the table and say, this is what we're going to do with these issues, with these partners in these configurations. So I think it's going to be a different speech than we've knew. It's also the first speech of Minister Sikorski, who is coming back after 8, almost 9 years. So I think he will also have some personal ambitions to make this a truly significant speech.
Now, when we look at bilateral relations between Poland and Ukraine, we obviously see the best relations probably in the history between the two nations. But are we to expect some significant changes in these relations that we didn't see before with the Law and Justice government?
Well, I think, again, the government has already indicated many times that the security of Ukraine, the future of this conflict, affects directly Poland, and we have to do everything to assist Ukraine in its war effort against Russia. Everything means also stabilizing our internal situation on the border specifically. We heard Prime Minister Tusk coming back just from Brussels and saying, we can no longer allow for individuals to block the border when our security is at stake. This is against our security. So I think there will be a lot of focus on how we're going to help Ukraine, not only in terms of galvanizing support worldwide, making sure that the military deliveries are conducted properly, helping Ukraine politically. But we also talk about, I think Minister will talk about these bilateral issues that are still on the table, including the question of transit through Poland. What I would want to see, and I'm afraid I'm not going to see in this speech, is a very strong commitment of Poland to future enlargements, especially of NATO. We as a think tank have been promoting for years the idea that the place of Ukraine is also among the member states of the North Atlantic Alliance. I understand very well that, you know, the momentum isn't there. The Washington summit, which is just in a few months, the NATO Washington summit would be a great opportunity to further this cause. But we see that this is not the case, and I think Poland will not be a front runner as it was in the past of advocating for this. I hope, however, that I will hear very strongly the support for EU accession of Ukraine. As we know, the negotiations might start any moment now. There has been a push for them with the EU, for Ukraine to open the first negotiation chapter still under the Belgian presidency, which ends by the end of June, because in July Hungary takes over. And the likelihood for the next half a year of significant progress of EU negotiations is very small. And then comes the Polish presidency of the EU. And I think, you know, that will be also one of our major presidency goals. So I think what we're going to see is also Minister Sikorski kind of lining up, you know, what we plan to do this year, also in this context of the EU presidency of Poland, which starts on the 1st of January 2025.
Very, very briefly, can you enumerate exactly why Poland isn't quite there when it comes to NATO?
I think we know that there is significant opposition currently in the Biden administration against NATO accession. I just came back from Washington on Sunday, talked about this in the Pentagon, in the National Security Council. It was very clearly stated that the United States right now sees security guarantees for Ukraine as a bilateral matter. So they're willing to sign, and they are signing memorandums of understanding with Ukraine. But we see and we know as Poles that there is nothing more ironclad than Article 5 of NATO. That it is one to have bilateral security guarantees, but it's a completely different story to be part of NATO. And that's why Sweden and Finland just joined. Yes, I mean, they are countries that can, to some extent, defend themselves. They had bilateral arrangements. They were in very close partnership with NATO. You would think that they are completely safe. And yet they wanted to have Article 5. And there is a very good reason for this. And of course, apart from the United States, there is opposition coming from other member states. So I think that the calculation here is that if there's no momentum, then there's right now that there are bigger things or more important things at the moment we can do for Ukraine. And you can't fight all the fights at the same time.
Moving on from that, there's been so much focus on rebuilding these outwardly relationships. And obviously there's been this so-called reactivation of the Weimar Triangle. But we're expecting that there's going to be a little bit of skepticism, if not a lot of skepticism, in regards to the Visegrad and the 3 Cs initiative. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very delicate balancing game that we're trying to play. One thing we don't want to see is to alienate any of our direct neighbors. We need everybody on board, including, to some extent, countries such as Hungary, which clearly is taking the wrong side in this conflict. So, of course, in terms of political potential, the Visegrad has very little. We still don't know how the Slovakian government will behave in the long term. They've just, you know, there was just also a presidential election in Slovakia, but it's clear that they will be much less Ukrainian-leaning and much more Russia-leaning in their foreign policy. But that has not yet played out, so we cannot judge that. But we have to engage bilaterally with these countries. So I think the format, the Visegrad format, will play a much smaller role, less significant, but I think we will still be investing a lot of energy in our relations with the Visegrad countries, just like we will be investing in the Baltic states and are investing. The one idea, apart from the Weimar, because we can talk about this separately, but one idea, that's also important, we tend to forget about the Baltic Sea. There is a group of Nordic Baltic countries, 4+3, and they are starting also to include Poland in their different initiatives. There's also one, for example, for ministers of defense. I think, and this is my wild guess, I don't know this, but I remember from previous years when Minister Sikorski was in his position, there was always a soft place for the Scandinavians. So I think there will be something also on the Scandinavian, again, Nordic, but also Baltic, not to exclude our direct Baltic neighbors, because these countries first share the responsibility for the Baltic, which is critical for our security. Second, absolutely share our worldview in terms of threats, in terms of challenges, in terms of how to deal with Russia. For example, I think there's no other countries that align so much with us. And number three, we could see the last few weeks even how the Nordic have stepped up in the assistance for Ukraine, including Danish, who have just announced that they will transfer all their air missile defense equipment into Ukraine. So I think that alignment is very, very important there. So having said that, all this happens in the EU context, all this happens in the NATO context. There is, so many different issues at the table, not only the question of enlargement of the EU, but the reform of the EU, right, the future of the European Union. So I think the 1.5 hours is a minimum for us in terms of really sitting there and listening, because there's so much to cover.
Absolutely. And now, as far as the EU, I mean, we all know that the previous government was, rather full of Eurosceptics, and this government led by Donald Tusk has a very different approach to the European Union. A few things I'd like to mention. Approval rating for Brussels right now is a record low in Poland, 51% according to the last opinion polls, which begs me to ask the question, will we see any significant policy change towards the European Union, and will that be difficult for the ruling coalition to achieve based on those numbers?
First, I'm kind of skeptical about this poll, because I've seen, in the...
Well, it doesn't mean they're Eurosceptics, right? It just means, it means that polls are contemplating the effectiveness of Brussels for one reason or another.
And this is natural, because we are in this very delicate moment in time when we simply doubt in a lot of things. For example, I think the lack of the aid package for Ukraine from the US Congress until last week also had a significant effect on how Poland and Polish people started to think about the United States. So we are in a kind of difficult momentum in our history, a moment in which we have some doubts. But again, I'm skeptical about this poll, because I saw other polls which showed a strong 60-65% support from the European Union. And of course, you have to ask people, would you want to exit the European Union? And then
that's
nobody wants to do that. So this is it's like being unhappy with your family, but it doesn't mean that you want to leave home and live somewhere else. So I think for membership, that support is really strong, continues to be very strong, and we continue to be one of the stronger supporters of EU accession. I think that's important to point out. Am I fearful about the future of our relation with the European Union? Well, first of all, we are the European Union, and I think that's important to remember. And now we have a very unique situation in which we can influence the EU agenda in ways we've never, ever been able to do before. I was in Washington heading a Weimar parliamentary delegation. So members of Parliament of Poland, France, and Germany went to the US Congress to advocate for the Ukrainian 60 billion aid package that the United States promised 6 months ago and could not deliver because of a complete blockage in the Congress. And this was the first ever Weimar parliamentary delegation because never before have our interests aligned to such a way that members of parliament would be comfortable speaking each other's language. Yes, the French had a different idea for their relations with the US, the Germans had a different idea, we had a completely different idea. We didn't see the value of one voice in Washington. That is absolutely changing, and I could see that. It was a huge surprise for congressmen that, major important partners from Europe are saying exactly the same thing. It was a comfortable situation for Poles, including myself, to listen to the Germans and French telling the Congress our arguments, why the US has to help Ukraine, it has to help Ukraine now, why the US has to remain engaged in Europe for the long term, not the short term, but also our ability to listen to the United States and to Americans saying, well, but you also have to take into considerations, our worries, our issues, the question of China, the question of, whether you are delivering. And we've also made the message, and it's a very strong message, that today Europe is delivering more aid to Ukraine than the United States. It is delivering 50% of military aid, and it is delivering 70% of financial aid to Ukraine, on top of the fact that in our countries, around 5 million Ukrainian refugees live, work, they have access to the internal market, so they have all rights as EU citizens do. That is also a cost, if you think about it, although that is also a benefit that we have, because many, as we know, especially here in Poland, Ukrainians work hard, and they are taxpayers, and they contribute to our economy.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've run out of time. As much as we have more questions that we'd like to ask, we're going to have to wait until Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski delivers his speech. And
I'll be there.
Yes, I think we'll have to bring you back in. Thank you very much,
That's
Professor
right.
Katarzyna Pisarska of the Pulaski Foundation and Chair of the Warsaw Security Forum. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.